Kalispera from Athens, where we are experiencing a heat wave of about 104 degrees Fahrenheit today. At least it's, as we were saying just a second ago with the speakers, at least it's a dry heat. And I don't know how it is on the East Coast, or Kalispera on the East Coast, and Kalimera to the rest of the United States. Welcome and thank you for joining us today for another CYA virtual lecture. And this is our 17th session. It's hard to fathom how time has gone by since we first started offering these lectures to our community. As of last June, our lectures have been very successful. We have been very fortunate so far to have had great speakers who are indeed experts in their fields, all affiliated with CYA one way or another, either as board members or as trustee emeriti, current and former faculty or alumni. Mind you, all of our lectures are available on College Here in Athens Tube channel. Also, you can see all the past 17 of them if you care to. These lectures have helped us stay connected to our community, to our friends, to our alumni. And today, we will discuss a very interesting subject, the future of classics. I'm very troubled, as I'm sure some of you are too, of the state of classics in the United States and the drop of university resources given to the humanities in general. And in addition, we now have the smear campaign against the classics and the accusation that they promote white supremacy, supposedly. CYA's mission is to promote the classics, in fact, in every possible way. And these developments give us cause for concern. I understand now classics probably is not the right word to use, but departments use Greek and Roman studies, or ancient Mediterranean studies, or Greek, Latin and Mediterranean studies. Somehow classics is becoming not an everyday word of everyday usage. I feel greatly honored that we have with us today an academic who has spent her entire career dealing with such matters. Besides being a distinguished and awarded professor in the humanities with many accolades, she has also served as a trustee of our institution for many years. We were very fortunate to have Mary Lefkowitz as a trustee of CYA, and Mary Lefkowitz is our speaker today. She is the Andrew W. Mellon Professor in the Humanities Emerita at Wellesley College, best known to non-classicists for her book, Not Out of Africa, which was published in 1996. She is the author of books, articles about ancient Greek literature and culture, including most recently Euripides and the Gods. She was the co-editor of Greek plays. Both of these books were in 2015. Then Women's Life in Greece and Rome, and then the Greek Histories. That's forthcoming in 2022. She holds her first degree from Wellesley and a PhD from Radcliffe College, plus honorary degrees from Trinity College, from Grinnell, from the University of Patras, and she's also the recipient of a National Humanities Medal. She's also now, since 2004, a trustee of the American School of Classical Studies at Athens. She's joined by Barbara Weiden Boyd, who accepted our invitation to serve as a discussant today, who will introduce the subject and channel questions at the end. Barbara Boyd is the Henry Winkley Professor of Latin and Greek at Bowdoin, holds a BA from Manhattanville College and an MA and PhD in classical studies from the University of Michigan. Her scholarly specialization is Latin poetry, especially the works of Virgil and Ovid. She's a former member of the board of directors of the Society for Classical Studies and the Goodwin Award Committee of the same society, and currently serves on its program committee. She's on her second year as president of the Vergilian Society and is a charter member of the International Ovidian Society. Boyd is committed to supporting and sustaining dialogue between and among the disciplines of the humanities, especially on literary and cultural topics. Professor Boyd, thank you for taking on this role today. Before I pass the floor on to you, let me say what I always say, that this is being recorded and the discussion will be saved and archived for future use. Those who do not wish to be recorded, please switch off your video cameras. Professor Boyd, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Philiktopoulos. And thank you to everyone who's here. And I see where the numbers are mounting. I keep seeing people entering the waiting room, and that's great to have so many people online with us today. I want to talk a little bit about how we're going to proceed, but first I wanted to just add to what you've already heard about me, namely that I've known Mary, I think Mary, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think it's now 36 years. So 36 years, and that was an interesting time because that was a time of some controversy as well. And Mary, as you know, was such a leading voice in introducing the study of women in the ancient world into classical studies and into academic studies generally. But that was a controversial issue at the time, believe it or not. Mary did have the opportunity to offer an NEH summer seminar on women in antiquity, and I was lucky enough to be one of the participants in that seminar. And that really changed my career in many ways, many very positive ways. It was such a great experience. And so it's wonderful to be able to be here with Mary today and with all of you, as I've said. In terms of how we're going to proceed, of course, the announcement you got says that Mary's going to give a talk and so forth. I think we're actually going to, because of the topic, we're actually going to make it into a little bit more of a conversation. And Mary will speak briefly, but then she and I will sort of go back and forth and talk about what we see happening. And what I would really like to emphasize, given, again, what we've just heard about the sort of problematic state of classics today, is I'd really like to focus on the future, because I want to guarantee that there is a future of classics. Whatever we call it is less of an issue than that there be a future to the study of the ancient Greeks and the ancient Romans, which is so important, so fundamental, and something that I think we all really love. We've certainly devoted a lot of our lives to it, Mary and I. So in terms of how this whole process will work with Zoom, as we proceed with our conversation, or Mary with her comments, you can submit your questions, any questions you have, through the chat feature on Zoom. And if you haven't used this before, I'll just direct you to the bottom of your screen, the Zoom screen, if you hover your cursor there, you will see one of the options is chat. And then you can type your question into the chat. I will try to keep track of all the comments in the chat. It depends on how many there are, but I'll try to keep track of them and then use them as a way to sort of direct our conversation. If you happen to be watching us on YouTube, apparently you can submit your questions in the comment sections, and we will try to get to those as well. I believe one of our colleagues is sort of in charge of getting that information to us. But with that, having said that, I would like to pass the microphone, as it were, pass it over to Mary and let her start us off.
Barbara, thank you very, very much. I think it's a very challenging topic, the future of the classics. And I'm sort of at the point of throwing my hands up and saying, I should know, yet I think there will be one because of the absolute centrality of the topic to a lot of things, which I'll try and talk about later. But I also feel, and this is kind of weird, when I started teaching, it was in the early 60s, and the hot topic was, is there going to be a future to the classics? Now think of this, it's 60 years ago. And is there going to be a future? It's not relevant. The big hue and cry then was relevance. Everything had to be relevant to today's problems. And whether that was political science, it was sort of political science was really big then, and economics, that was going to solve everything. So I feel this is where I came in. One of the things that was thought to be catastrophic by a lot of classicists was that Latin was being dropped as a requirement in many schools and also into getting into universities or colleges at that time. So that was going to destroy the whole field. Well, as I think we all know, it didn't. It was dropped as a college, the college entrance exam was beginning to die off. The Greek one, there was a Greek college entrance exam, and that was dropped. Yet the subject continues somehow. We adjusted as teachers. We adjusted the curriculum. We didn't make so many assumptions about people understanding or knowing what the value of classics would be. And maybe the topic classics, the name classics is confusing. Maybe we can change that, but you still have to teach Greek and Latin because those are the languages in which so much of the literature is written. It would be nice if it was written in other languages, but think of how much more work that would be. So, another thing that occurs to me is, you say, well, what is the use of reading all this old stuff? It's, it's passé. And yet I've been working on Thucydides on and off, mostly on, for the last couple of years. And nothing could be more relevant. Nothing could be, I think, a better guide to some of the problems we've had in the United States. And these are not unique to the United States. In what I consider to be one of the most scary episodes in my life, which was January 6th. And the democracy under tremendous threat. And democracy is something, of course, that matters tremendously. And it has been, with all its faults, one of the best systems of government that's ever existed. And yet here is Thucydides showing just where the cracks are, just how someone who says what you want to hear, like Alcibiades, can lead you into terrible disasters. I won't mention any names. It's a name I don't want to mention.
Mary, can I jump in and just comment, in terms of Thucydides? I think for many of us, certainly for me, the past year has also been a year of thinking about the plague in Athens,
Oh, yeah.
and how something like that can really damage a polity, right? That this is something that really has effects that aren't purely medical, right? They're not purely about our health
I think
physically, they're
Thucydides
also about
yeah,
our, yeah.
Thucydides mentions the medical side, not very effectively, but
Mhm.
then where he really comes out is what it did to Athenian society. Right before it is Pericles' great speech, his funeral oration with all the ideals of Athenian society laid before us. And then suddenly this disaster comes and people's morals begin to collapse. They just become interested in accumulating money. They disregard the religious traditions. They were, think of what Antigone goes through to bury her brother's body. Well, none of that. They just dumped bodies of dead wherever they could put them. And so Thucydides, it's a prelude to the disaster that later comes when the Athenians, for all the wrong reasons, decide to invade Sicily. And I think that's a point that had been made and then really not followed up on by the late Adam Parry, who was a very, very talented professor of classics at Yale and died much too young. Anyway, so that's a very good point, Barbara. I think we everyone can learn a lot from rereading Thucydides' description of the plague. So, and in a way, you could get away with reading everything in English. You don't have to read it in Greek to get the main point. It's of course always better, I think, if you can understand any language, but not everyone's going to have the time. But for those of us who do, it's great. So I think that we can talk about how some of the great literature that's in Greek and Latin have influenced European thought for better and for worse. And we can talk about how studying ancient religion, even though it's trivialized in a lot of mythology books, is very interesting because polytheism at least is more tolerant than monotheism. And we can learn something about the limitations of our own dominant monotheistic religions in the West and East, a lot of it, Middle East certainly, what's wrong with them and some of the things that they have done. It's, persecution, religious persecution is something that is very much with us still. It began with Judaism, it continued into Christianity and right into Islam. So these are things that polytheism didn't do in quite the same way.
Right. That's right.
So I think also you could say, and I just speak of this as a convert to classics through Latin. When I started Latin as a schoolgirl, it was required, so I took it. And so I had this almost religious experience, which is, I still remember. I was reading a book about, it was written in Latin that was basically, based on English because it was about a little English schoolgirl named Julia, only it was Julia Puella Parva Est, and I could, and I got that far. But what happened was suddenly I got the point of an inflected language. And I began to understand English grammar, which I had never done through diagramming sentences. And it was almost like a religious experience. I had to keep going. And of course, when they offered Greek, I thought, well, even better. I'll learn another great language, which would be, we could pass notes in Greek letters and no one could read them. That was another great advantage. But seriously, it was, for me, almost like a religious experience. And I've never regretted it because it is so much fun and so interesting to teach. So Latin, the purpose of teaching Latin was not so much to indoctrinate anyone. The purpose was to teach people to understand English language and grammar. And so you knew what a lot of words meant. And you didn't have to look everything up all the time. That was one of the reasons it was always kept. It wasn't just to read the literature, though there's great literature out there. And, you know, if you haven't read Virgil, it's just really a pity. But we could say that of a lot of other things too. But let me just talk about one topic that's come up in a rather disturbing way and influential way lately. Is classics by definition racist? Well, let's think for a moment, because was there race-based prejudice and discrimination in antiquity? And there really wasn't. It's not like the kind of race-based, and it's very serious thing in the United States, which it shouldn't be. It should have changed after the Civil War, but it did not. And I believe it was fundamental to some of the terrible things that have happened in American democracy lately. But does classics encourage the study of that? No, it doesn't. It doesn't address it directly. And maybe that's a problem. If everything has to be relevant and address the problems of society directly, then why are we studying any kind of history? Why are we just studying any kind of other language? I don't think it is, because thinking and learning to analyze language and learning to analyze literature helps us to analyze our thought. And that would help us to deal with our own problems.
Mary, I'm going to jump in again and just comment. You know, you were talking about history and other languages besides Latin and Greek. But in fact, in the universities today here in the US, the study of those areas as well is plummeting. Right. So classics, although it has a distinctive position, partly because of its incredible tradition, right, but also it is this ancient tradition. But classics is not unique in that so many other areas in the humanities they're not disappearing, but they're becoming much more, I'll say, marginalized within the university curriculum today. And I think that's a cause for real concern. So it's not just ancient studies, it's history, it's Spanish literature, it's German literature, it's all the different, Russian, Chinese. These are all becoming marginalized as we see a much more sort of skills-oriented drive in higher education today. And classics is not, although it is an amazing skill, it doesn't sell itself that way, right? So the other thing I wanted to say, just in terms of the adaptations that we've been through over the years, I would say that classics has been really good at, to use some of the language that we've heard this year with COVID, resilient. We've been incredibly resilient. We've also been able to pivot, right, as we've seen changes in the demographics of our students. And it is absolutely true that we now get many students, even at you might say the best colleges and universities, although there are very many fine institutions. But even there, we're seeing students who don't even know what classics is, right? So that's one of the reasons why there is a drive to rethink the name of the discipline, but that's a sort of I would think that that's less important than some of the other issues we're facing. And I just also want to pick up on a comment that you've received, Mary, as you were talking about Thucydides, that some people have suggested that classics should design courses oriented more towards ethics and morality than towards Latin and Greek. What are your thoughts on this approach as a way of drawing students into the field?
Well, if it works, fine.
Exactly.
I think
Yeah,
ethics and morality are topics that come up all the time in ancient literature. It's very central. I mean, it's so central to human life. We're always going on about this. So definitely, I would say that. I just wanted to also say that about the ancient world being not any more racist than anything else, in fact, not racist in our sense at all, is that being enslaved was, an equal opportunity option of a bad sort for absolutely everybody, whoever they were. And so it's a very different world. And it's interesting to think about that, because everyone understood what it was like to be a slave, because they could so easily become one if they lost the war. So I think that's, basically all I had been planning to say. I could, I think, to abolish a classics department on the grounds that it was racist would be a terrible way to go and totally unfair. It's not at all true. And classics may be totally the wrong term for the discipline. It just is one that's traditional. But I think that it's how we present ourselves. We need to think about very carefully as people who are professing the field and teaching it. But I think that I agree that humanities are under threat because the humanities don't sell themselves very well as a discipline. And also they've gone in much too much, I think, for theory and not for the content of what people are reading. That great content from reading any great work of literature in any language or in English translation is still why you read things. And it's not any theoretical or sort of political value.
Right. There's the whole issue of the sort of the price tag. First of all, the price tag on education in the United States is so significant that has, and the tendency that we see within institutions of higher education in the US to adopt more and more of a business model, so that we're seeing a greater emphasis on things like the number of enrollments, and that's really what validates the importance of a discipline rather than any inherent qualities. So if you have really big enrollments in, let's say, political science, but not very big enrollments in philosophy or in classics, then there's a tendency to put let all the resources go towards that more popular area, rather than having an administration that says, no, wait a minute, this other stuff is also really important. Right. So that's an important component. We're starting to get quite a few comments and questions, Mary. And so how about if I sort of start working with them and I'll introduce them. So first we have a comment from Anastasia Janakidou from the University of Chicago. She is very concerned about the significance of language study in particular, and she is wondering what we think about the recent move by Princeton to not require Latin and Greek for a classics degree. So I have thoughts, but I'll let you start.
Well, my feeling would be if they've done that, it's partly to increase enrollments, because people are scared by taking the ancient languages, and they think, well, we'd like to know something about it, and so this would be a way to draw people in, which is sort of the approach I always took when I was teaching. That was very, you put a lot of energy into classical civilization, or whatever you want to call them, courses, because that's where you will reach the most people.
Right.
So I think that is what we should be doing. Though, you know, I love teaching advanced language, but
Exactly.
what do you think, Barbara?
There's also a comment from Lexi Henning that that I think supports what you're saying, Mary, that maybe what Princeton is doing is the right idea, because it makes, by making the languages optional, it does away with a kind of gatekeeping, right, that has had to that has prevailed in keeping particularly students from lower down on the socioeconomic scale from giving them access to study in the humanities and classics in particular. So it definitely, I think we agree with that. And I would just say, I would like to put the Princeton thing in a certain sort of perspective and sort of laugh at the whole story. It's rather, I would call myself bemused by this big brouhaha about Princeton, because most of us particularly at small liberal arts colleges, that is, places that don't have PhD programs and that are focused entirely on the education of undergraduates, we've already done this, or we've done something very similar. We've made the language requirement very, very, very small, so that students who have no idea when they arrive at college what classics is can nonetheless have a very rewarding experience through an intensive study of ancient history, of mythology, of classical literature, of archaeology. All of those components of the ancient world come to the fore in a program like that. And if those students end up picking up language, one of the languages, and they're constantly being encouraged by us to do so, if they do that, all the better, right? But it's a way of, you know, the idea, as someone else mentions here, that Latin is elitist. It's a way of saying, no. It's maybe challenging, but it's not elitist. It's just we want to show you what's so great about the civilization of the Greek world, the Roman world, and give you reasons to want to study these languages.
Yeah, I think, and if it's done just say to attract minority students, well, so much the better. But certainly minority students can do language just as well as anybody else. It's just a ridiculous idea that they can. And I've seen it over and over again.
Anastasia Giannakidou has continued with comments on, I would disagree with you, Ms. Giannakidou, Professor Giannakidou, that you say it's unimaginable to think a Department of German not requiring German or Japanese not requiring Japanese. In fact, if you reconfigure things, so rather than thinking of a Department of Japanese, you think of a Department of Asian Studies, and we have a thriving Department of Asian Studies at Bowdoin. Many students have passed through that program without much, if any, study of Chinese or Japanese or whatever the area of concentration is. And, you know, so I think that in fact, the reality is it is becoming more and more possible in other language areas as well. That's controversial. That's not what I would recommend, but that's sort of what's happening on the ground. So
it may change, all these things
Right.
change over time. Things that you think are immutable suddenly do change. Suddenly the commercial world discovers a need for ethics at that time.
Yeah, when will that happen?
Well, it was supposed to happen 20, 25 or 30 years ago. It didn't quite make it, but philosophy was very useful all of a sudden.
Right. Yeah, we at Bowdoin had gone through a big curricular review, and one of the recommendations was that, and this was right around 2018, and one of the big recommendations that we were talking a lot about was how to pursue how to promote a more values and ethics focused curriculum across the college. And I think that was a really valuable conversation that we, and certainly classics had a big role to play in that conversation. But then when COVID happened, that sort of just evaporated. That's no longer the number one or even number 10 important topic for us right now. So sometimes we don't have control over.
No, and we have yet to see what this plague will produce in the way of transformation, which may be as profound. Probably the disaster level in the West may not have reached the level it did in proportionately as it did in Athens to cause damage to the sort of ethical system as we know it did. Thucydides tells us it did in Athens in 430-29 BC. But it may have some profound consequences that we have not enough perspective to see now.
Yeah, and I just to pursue that a little bit with the, where the languages feature, certainly in my ideal university, Latin and Greek, and the study of these languages and the texts that are in Latin and Greek would be central. But of course, that's just my view of the world. I also do think, however, and this is a topic that appears in the chat now, I also do think, though, that the whole issue, not just of the languages per se and of the literatures per se, but of their reception over time, is a really, really important one, because that's where we get at the cultural impact of the classics, is by really focusing on reception. And the person asking this question says, well, if without the languages, it's only reception, I would take away the only and say, yes, it is reception. And reception is really important in and of itself. That is understanding how someone like Thomas Jefferson understood Cato and Cicero when he read them, how he used them to justify, for example, his ownership of slaves, but also how he used them to justify his immense contributions to the work of democracy, right? That these are both important aspects of the reception of the classics, and that this is something that's worth studying in and of itself. Back to you, Mary.
Well, I totally agree. I think you have to see criticism at any period of time in terms of reception and in terms of what was going on in the political scene at the time that whoever was writing it. But let's have some more questions.
Yeah, I mean, we're getting more comments that are sort of responding. Here's someone, let's see, Noah Galp says, I wonder if we should not offer more classics in the modern application of classics. In fact, that's happening, right? That is happening already. We're seeing, I have a colleague who's taught a really interesting course with a colleague in our history department on democracy, ancient and modern. And they do one unit on American democracy and then a unit on democracy in the ancient world. Half of the course taught, and they're interested in comparing, looking at the differences, looking at what's distinctive about each model, but also about how they interact, right? How the ancient has informed the modern version. And how we think about the ancient version because we live with a modern version. I think that's really important. And certainly we see all classics departments, I think, teaching courses that engage with the subject of slavery, that engage with the subject of sexuality and gender in the ancient world. These are all topics that are integral to the study of classics today. Study of classics today is totally different from what I experienced as an undergraduate.
Oh, for sure.
Which was Latin and Greek, period. Right?
Yeah.
It's much more interdisciplinary and very aware of the real world that's bumping up against us constantly. So somebody comments here, it seems ironic to me, this is Nano Marinatos, it seems ironic to me that while US institutions are putting so much emphasis on diversity and inclusion, that they are not at the same time watering down the study of language and intellectual diversity. Why do you think this contribution exists? Darwin insisted on biological diversity. Why do we limit intellectual diversity? That's from Nano. And Jorge Bravo is with us somewhere. Hi, Jorge. In any case, yeah, I mean, that's a really good question. I've been troubled throughout my professional career by the way in which the American, and I think it's a distinctively American problem, the American system undervalues language study and cultural study other than American generally. And if you've been through and if you've experienced any of the contemporary programs about diversity and inclusion that all of our institutions are introducing, the focus is almost always on the present and always on America now.
And that's really a pity, isn't it?
Yeah, it's really unfortunate that there's no sort of historical context. There's no broader embrace. It's focused on one topic. So
well, it's so urgent, and it was such a critical factor in current events. I can definitely understand that. Yet perspective is what we all need all the time in everything we do, and we don't get much of it. And there's such urgency to correct all the ills of society. And I guess, the long experience has taught a lot of us that nothing happens very quickly or very easily. And for all our very good intentions, and probably the most important part of liberal arts education is to teach people how to think critically about themselves and about any subject and not believe the first thing they read, which is definitely something you can learn from studying ancient Greek literature or ancient Roman literature. And this is something we could emphasize, but it's American society is very materialistic, understatement of the world. So this is something.
Well, it's materialistic, but it's also very much it's all about the present, and it's very much focused on the self, right?
Yeah.
What oneself wants and needs and so forth. I know when I first started classical languages in high school, I began with Latin, and then I did have a year of Greek as a senior in high school. But to me, what the appeal was that I was able to move beyond myself, that this was a field that allowed me to experience forms of experience that were not like my own, right? That difference was so important to me, that I could imagine a world in which, Aeneas is leaving Troy and going to Italy, and this had no political connotations for me, but it did have connotations about exploration, about identity in a very personal way. And I think that it's unfortunate, but it's a fact of American education, that the emphasis is totally on the present and on us in America and what shapes our experience as Americans. And I think that's one of the reasons why, as I said earlier, the humanities in general is an area where we're seeing so many disciplines struggle, because the importance of history. I mean, who could imagine that history would undergo this challenge? And yet it does. Right, it is. The number of history majors at Bowdoin, I wouldn't be able to give you a precise number, but it is far less than half what it was even 10 years ago. And that's a problem. I don't think Mary and I are going to have a solution for that. But other than, as I said earlier, one of the things that classics has that I think guarantees that we will have a future is that we have we are able to negotiate, because the field has so many things in it and so many opportunities. We're able to negotiate ways to find our place in whatever the contemporary conversation is. And so classics, I think, is going to, I think we may well see, and again, it's not the department that I would want, we may well see that the languages really become a much less important part of the undergraduate curriculum. And therefore, it's going to be a lot harder to sort of get through a PhD program. But in any case, we're going to see the language is less important, but we're going to see that the sort of democratization, as it were, of the discipline. Okay.
Yes, I think that's all very true. And it is hard to get Americans to study language, yet it's so important. I think if we if more of us lived on the border with Mexico, we might see the importance of learning Spanish, and particularly with all the problems with immigrants coming in and their terrible problems and the problems of government in Spanish-speaking countries to the south of us, we might, that's what better argument could there be for studying Spanish? And yet people don't do it enough. Everyone probably should learn that. And Latin would be a good way to learn Spanish. I'm just thinking of what some of my Hispanic students were able to whiz through because they had all that vocabulary behind them. But I think that, as usual, it's the sort of over-materialism of this American society that drives us to some of these very temporary solutions, even in universities. And and then there's always the financial factor, which is American universities, of course, very much oriented to what programs produce the most income to them, or get them the most publicity, or whatever it is. And then the languages and classics among them will suffer in that. I think we also need to confront, the issues that have been raised recently about whether the study of the classics is racist, which I think, as I said, is really not a productive discussion, and not one that has any basis, except to say that there are it has been a field that's been dominated by white people teaching it. But that's because, I would say, many students who come from disadvantaged backgrounds, as a lot of African American students have done and Hispanic students have done, have decided they've got to go into more lucrative fields than a PhD in a humanities subject. It's just not where you make your money, and much as they love it.
Mary, can I jump in and say, I mean, another way to think about it is, we could say the whiteness of classics is the same as the whiteness of physics, as the whiteness of chemistry, as the whiteness of, German departments. I mean, frankly, it's not really, it is an issue, but it's not the top issue, I think, for us. And our time is shrinking here. And I do want to get to 2 points, 2 very different points that have come up in the comments. One, and please forgive me if I haven't gotten to your comments. I'm trying to pick out the ones that, raise the most sort of challenging questions. Tasas Anastasiadis asks, are we going to have a time when classics departments will hire professors of classics that do not know the ancient languages? No, we're not going to have that. That's at least not if I can help it, not if Mary. That's simply, then that's not going to be a classics department, right?
You have to be able to correct the translation.
You need to have, proven yourself in a rigorous PhD program where you demonstrate your sophistication in the 2 languages, right? So I'm not going to worry about that, at least right now, because I think that's not going to happen in our lifetimes, any of us who are on in this conversation right now. In terms of a classics light degree, to some extent, I agree that that's maybe not ideal. On the other hand, I would ask any of you who thinks that doing something in translation makes it classics light. Well, if you think about a history major, they're not doing things in the languages in which they were written. They're not reading, de Tocqueville in French. They're not reading Gibbon in German. Excuse me, he's in English. No, but they're not reading anything in German. So in fact, the idea of a classics degree that's not language centric is not anomalous within contemporary American university education.
No,
I would say, to change the subject to, I think a much more important and promising and future focused area is a comment from Jennifer Blum on the current rise of popular reading relating to classical history and literature, including Toynbee's House of Names, Pat Barker's Silence of the Girls, Thomas Ricks' First Principles. Thomas Ricks, living here in Brunswick, Maine. We know him well. Tom Ricks' First Principles. And to that, I would add, Marilyn Miller's Circe, and there's a new Ariadne coming out. I mean, it's the classical world is everywhere. It is not going away. It is with us. It is so important to us. And, but but the educational system is changing as well. So,
yeah, mythology has really been a big seller in universities throughout the country for many years. And people take that and love it and read it in various forms. And so it still has some appeal, however they get into it. And I think that's something I could have mentioned because it's something I used to teach and occupied a lot of my thinking. And I see that as being something that can be taught and has been taught for a very long time in English. It's, you know, that we're having this discussion, I think, is a very good thing. And I think it's important to be challenged, just so one was never complacent and never takes anything for granted. And we shouldn't in ourselves, and we shouldn't in our educational system. And I think that, you know, if any of these challenges are worthwhile, if we approach them in a very constructive way, and it makes us think how and why we could even do better in what we're teaching and in what we're writing and thinking about.
Thank you. Yeah, I agree wholeheartedly with Mary. And as we approach our ending, I just want to comment again. We have so many comments about the importance of language study, and we are with you. That is what brought both Mary and me into the field. That is what we have dedicated our lives to. There's nothing more rewarding to me than sitting with a group of, most often it's Latin, although I do teach plenty of Greek as well. And I will say one of the most profound experiences of my life is teaching Homer, right? Reading Homer with my students. But I think about more recently reading some Latin literature, reading Lucretius on the nature of things with my students, and how profoundly important that is, how valuable that is. But the only way we can convince so many of our students that this is worth doing is by taking them by the hand and leading them to the languages. And the way to do that is through the courses in translation, through the curriculum in translation. And if some of them choose not to do that, well, you know, not to do Latin, not to do Greek, but they still want to be classics majors, and we call it classics light, as someone has said. Well, that's their degree. That's not my degree. That's their degree. So I think that there's a choice that people make, but what we're able to do is make it possible. And that's kind of, I think, where the future of classics is making it possible for more people to appreciate how valuable what we do is. I think all of you who've come today have demonstrated just by your presence how valuable it is to you. And Mary and I really, really appreciate your presence here.
No, and I appreciate how much you care. And of course, we care tremendously. We can't, of course, do the impossible, and we're struggling against, you know, just the focus of American society, which is always going to be away from doing the things we do. But as someone who really got into the classics through language, I do appreciate so much and care so much about the study of language as a way to get out of oneself and this kind of self-centered focus that American life has encouraged in us. Is there any more questions we should have here that we should have, issues that we haven't addressed?
I don't think so. I think, I think in the chat, I'm seeing, many more comments about the relative importance of language study, not just in class, within a language department or a language centered department, but also in history and so forth. But I think we've already, addressed that. We're already on that. And then maybe the way to close is to quote Elizabeth Filiotis saying, Mary's books about mythology will give you excellent reasons to pursue classics, even without language knowledge. Sell yourselves, please. Thank you for the discussion. Yeah, so that was a great comment. Thank you. We really appreciate it. Yeah.
Okay.
So, Alexei, shall I hand it back to you?
If you want to. Thank you, both of you, Mary and Barbara. You've done a great job today. I liked your profound statement, Mary, about your conviction that the study of foreign languages has a very, very deep effect on students. Anyway, I want to toot our own horn a little bit and say that in this institution of ours, foreign languages, classical languages, both Latin and Greek are protected species, so to speak. We offer it on all levels, beginners, intermediate and advanced, no matter how many students are attending. And we even had a beginner's Latin class last semester with one student. Yeah, so this is this says something about our degree of conviction on this subject.
That's great.
I've never seen in our 17 lectures in the past so much activity in the chat box. And there was a very much of a discourse going on, engaged dialogue between various participants, between them and so forth. But I think we may have run the risk of not answering some of the questions. So I will ask you to do a little labor of love, and we will forward you all the chatter, and you, Mary and Barbara, can see whether there were any questions, issues that were not addressed, and perhaps you can write back to those who posed the questions. Anyway, as we conclude today's session, may I remind you all that that all who are registered today, not just who attended, all registered will be receiving the link to the lecture by Friday of this week. And we will continue to bring the service to our audience to celebrate the oldest and, well, I don't want to say anything more, the oldest study abroad program in Greece, that's CYA. As we approach normality, I hope that we can manage to see each other more and not always have these meetings virtually. With these words, I want to wish all of our viewers today good health, and we hope that you will have a great remainder of the summer in the safest possible way. And we'll be back with you in September. Thank you very, very much.